Hello, Alexandra. Hello, Simeon.
Hello.
Good morning. So we have a couple of minutes to wait for the other speakers to join before admitting the audience. Alexandra knows it already, but for you to tell you, we have been informed this morning that both Maya and Manuel are not available for different reasons, sick leave and other issues, but we will manage.
So it will then be just myself and who was the fourth participant?
Johann
Johann.
Yeah, yes. So we'll have to figure it out among ourselves.
Okay. I hope Johann managed to confirm.
I hope so too. But we do have the slides from Manuel, right? Livia?
Yes, yes. Do you want me to share them in any case? I was hiding them, but if you want, but who would present them?
I can, well, without the professional background, but maybe, I don't know. Should we still mention them? We can mention them.
If you want, I can show them and you can say something.
The challenges, yeah.
Sound check. Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, so Alexandra, if you want, I will leave the slides of Manuel in the presentation and you can mention something.
Yeah, just perhaps, you know, I wouldn't talk about his background, but just to say, you know, what are the issues that he identified, because that could be useful for the mural, for the notes.
Okay, I can move his presentation at the end if you prefer after Jochen.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, Jochen, we were just saying before you joined that unfortunately we just found out yesterday evening and this morning that Maya and Manuel are not able to join. So it is just us.
Small group, that's fine.
Yes. In Italian they say pochi ma buoni. No, Livia?
Yes, correct.
A few, but good one.
In that case, maybe we will have more time to work directly on the mural, perhaps.
Indeed, because we'll have more time to discuss.
Okay, if you are all ready and there is nothing to check before, I would let the audience start coming in and I will put some music. We can wait a few minutes and whenever Alexandra is ready, we can start.
Or Simeon, if you want to.
Yeah.
If you want to start it.
I thought, Alexandra, that you would have the chairing role, and of course, yes, I can add something. But because I think I present also myself as a panelist, perhaps it's better if you start. I don't know.
I think we will all be co-chairing.
Yes, yes.
I got a question on Twitter. If slides or recordings are shared, I wasn't sure what to say.
So probably yes. I mean, we are recording this session. We didn't yet discuss if the recording is just for the purpose of writing the report or if we are going to publish them online, but I will send an email to the speakers in any case to ask for their approval. Do you have any concern?
I'm okay with that.
Okay.
You can share the slides and
Okay.
the recording.
Okay, perfect.
In my experience, it's better received if the recording is cut into some manageable pieces, because people struggle to
exactly
navigate in a 4-hour recording. So if you have some software to kind of say, oh, that's this panel, that's this talk, so people can, you know, check out every little bit if they like it or if they want to listen to it, that might make it more received by the audience.
Yeah, we will have to do some cutting of the video to make them presentable for being uploaded online. Okay, Alexandra, could you access the mural link?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect.
Everything is okay.
Then I will start to admit your attendees.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second block of parallel sessions on vertical vertical look on specific domain needs in the data quality standards for inclusive, non-biased, and trustworthy AI. Unfortunately, we have just received news yesterday evening that Maya Pantic and also Manuel Gomez will not be able to join as panelists due to personal issues. So, but we promise that it will be an interesting session nonetheless, and I'm sure we will have plenty to discuss, as we have seen in other sessions. I think that the time allocated is very short, so we will have plenty of room for discussions. Just to mention again, as we you could see in the leaflet presentation, in the AI Act, there is a horizontal look on AI requirements, but we are also looking at specific needs in certain domains in order to make sure that certain aspects that are domain dependent are also looked at in view of standardization efforts. For AI and for media, AI in media, this is not classified as a high-risk domain under the AI Act, but in the sector of media, including social media, content moderation, and recommender systems, are very important, taking into account their societal relevance. And they are made object of some obligations under the AI Act and the upcoming Digital Services Act. So without further ado, I will give the start to this session, and just to remind everyone that you can ask questions using Slido. Just use the hashtag standards for AI and select the media room. Regarding the Zoom chat, please ask just technical questions to the host in the Zoom chat if possible. And please, for bandwidth reasons, keep your camera and audio off when you are not speaking. So, of course, this does not apply to the panel members. In this session, we will be talking about requirements for data quality in AI as employed in media, and especially in media and social media. And we will be using this structure in order to produce our output that we'll also be presenting during the flash presentations from the session's output. The first step will be a brainstorming, and that will be based also on the input that you will be given through the short presentations that our panelists have prepared. Further on, we will do a mapping of existing and of course stressing more on the needs, the remaining needs to identify and compare data for training of AI systems and their use within AI systems at the different stages. So we will try to, let's say, map what exactly is missing. And then we will also think together of what is most urgent to be done, and also what is more long-term effort. So with this, I leave the floor to our first speaker, Simeon Papadopoulos. Thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you, Alexandra, very much for the introduction. I'm a senior researcher at CERF ITI. This is a research center in Greece, and my background is on computer science, and in particular large-scale multimedia analysis and mining. And I have a keen interest in the sector of media and social media for a number of years now. My research activities are primarily driven by our team's involvement in a number of EU-funded research projects, and a number of these projects during the last 5-6 years have been dealing with the problem of online disinformation. And our team is particularly experienced in building media verification solutions, including, for instance, image forensics, very well-established field in computer science, more recently deepfake detection, social network mining using graph-based methods, and more recently content moderation techniques. Another very important aspect that we've been dealing with, especially during the last couple of years, is the aspect of AI bias and fairness, which is one of the central focal points in this workshop. And we are particularly interested in bias discovery in visual datasets and bias mitigation methods. I would like to mention here some of the relevant EU projects that drive this type of research. So one project that has recently finished is called We Verify. That's where we developed a number of media verification solutions. And 3 projects that are currently ongoing are AI for Media, which is a large network of AI excellence, one of the 4 such networks in Europe, which has a particular focus on the media and social media sector. Another project is called No Bias, which is a Marie Curie network with PhD students there focusing on a number of issues related to the emergence, measurement and mitigation and explanation of bias in socio-technical systems. And another project that I'm also coordinating is called Mediaverse, and there one of our areas of interest is the development of content moderation systems that are possible to use in a federated setting, so that they give the necessary flexibility to stakeholders to adapt their solutions to their local context. Maybe we can go to the next slide. Through this research, through our collaboration with different actors in the field, we have long-standing collaborations with media companies, for instance, like Deutsche Welle and AFP. Also fact checkers. We have strong links to the EDMO, the European Digital Media Observatory, and other related organizations. We have identified a number of challenges also, of course, in the context of our own research. Given the focus of this workshop on bias in AI, I think one very fundamental challenge that we face is the question of what is bias and how to define it. People who are familiar with the literature in bias in AI are probably aware that there is a number of definitions depending on the viewpoint and depending on the system at hand. And some of them are even contradicting or at least in conflict with each other. For instance, there is individual fairness and there is also group fairness, and it's often impossible to maximize both. And also even though bias, AI bias, initially was considered in the context of easy to measure variables like in tabular data, for instance, coming from the banking or the financial sector. There are also cases, especially in the media sector, where bias is much harder to capture and quantify. And it's not only often we think of bias as, for instance, kind of statistical parity between genders or between races, but there are, in the media sector, there are more subtle types of bias, like, for instance, how certain groups are pictured in the media, how they are framed, what kind of narratives develop around them. So these are types of bias that are really hard to quantify. A second very important challenge, at least from my perspective as an academic, is the fact that we often do not have access to sufficiently good data sets or sufficiently representative data sets. And what do we mean by that? Typically, when we study a research question or when we want to develop an AI system, like a content moderation solution for a particular type of harmful content, we need to train a model and evaluate it in a data set. In the academic world, there are a number of public data sets typically developed by individual teams. But it is often the case that these datasets are not adequate nor representative of the actual problem at hand. It is actually the large platforms, the social media platforms and other big digital platforms that have access to the full-scale data and are aware of the actual problems at hand. So there is a very big discrepancy between the actual challenges that these actors are facing and the scale and the complexity of the problem that academics try to solve. And to make matters a bit more challenging, we have the problem of concept drift, which is essentially that what our problem is today is by no means the same as what will be tomorrow. And just to give an example, what is considered harmful content or, for instance, harassment today is not the same as what it was a few years back. And the same for many types of content moderation related tasks. An aspect and kind of finding or conclusion after our work in the last years is that working in interdisciplinary teams where, in addition to the AI experts, we also have domain experts like experts from the media sector is really valuable and instrumental to gain a more complete, comprehensive understanding of the problem and to develop more useful solutions. It's an approach that, even though someone might think that this is something that is trivial or that everyone should be doing it, it's rarely the case in the academic world. And through our experience in these European projects that I mentioned before, we've seen the value of being in constant interaction with people from the media sector. And another important solution in that respect and valuable direction is to create representative data sets that are most importantly reusable by the community. So creating internal benchmarks might be useful for certain organizations, but it's by no means impactful for the community. And of course, there are certain, actually many copyright and privacy issues involved in this process. Maybe we can move to the next slide, where I will conclude with my thoughts on the way forward and next steps. Yes, benchmark datasets, I think it's a cornerstone of AI research, but one fundamental question we should ask ourselves is what makes a dataset good and relevant. I'm not sure there is sufficient understanding, and there are sufficient tools in assessing the quality in datasets. Of course, we can do some superficial quality checks and some descriptive statistics on the features, on the labels of the dataset. But this does not by any means guarantee that for instance, the labels that have been added are of sufficient quality, and even that the selected categories, classes are the most appropriate ones for the problem at hand. So we need auditing tools in order to be able, to extract some indicators with respect to the quality or compliance of a dataset in terms of certain dimensions of interest. And for instance, demographic parity or demographic representativeness of a dataset, the potential emergence of different types of bias, all those are very important aspects. And there are, of course, yes, there are open source frameworks and some tools that are trying to already deal with this problem, but I think we are still in the beginning and more is needed. And especially for academics, there is, I think, we are often coming up again with the question of whether our research is compliant to a number of regulations. We are now very well familiar with GDPR, which is already in place for many years. But with the emergence of the AI regulation, for instance, I think we will face a similar situation. So we would need clear guidelines and best practices or anything else, anything in addition to the regulation text, which is very hard to parse by non-legal people. We need such simple guidelines and best practices to be sure that our research is in compliance. And therefore, just to to summarize into short-term goals and long-term goals that I think communities should try to tackle, we need, I think, foundations and resources. And by foundations, I mean very clear vocabularies, taxonomies. For instance, in the case of content moderation, we need to have clear definitions what types of harmful content there are, what is the process of classifying a piece of content as harmful or not, and for each type of harmful content, like for instance in the case of hate speech, we need also to have a very fine-grained understanding of the different contexts that something is classified as hateful content. Similar case with disinformation. It's a really complex problem, and it's very hard to come up with very clear definitions, but it's an effort that as a community we need to try to make. And the same goes for resources. which means data sets, pre-trained models, reference algorithm implementations. Those are really valuable building blocks and can help, towards a more commonly accepted and standardized view of the problem. And in the long run, we need, more established and commonly accepted tools, standard tools that can be used by both academia and industry to measure and mitigate bias and also to assess compliance in terms of different dimensions of interest. So I would like to conclude here. I don't know if there is any question or comment.
Thank you so much for all the different aspects you brought into the discussion. I think we can already see there are many different needs in this area specifically that still require guidelines and standardization efforts. I would suggest we move on to Johann, and then we will. There are no questions on Slido, but hopefully in the meantime there will be also questions, and then we can start our brainstorming and mapping exercise. Thank you so much. And with this, I would like to introduce Dr. Johann Lightner from Coburg University as our next speaker. Johann, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alexandra, and thanks for having me. So I haven't got a slide, so this is really two introductory slides to a panel just to recall, but I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So my role is I'm professor of explainable and responsible artificial intelligence in Coburg in Germany, and a visiting professor of data analytics in Sheffield in the UK. I have mostly worked in industry. However, I also have some spells in academia, like currently. I worked at SAP as a software developer. I worked for 13 years in the Thomson Reuters family of companies in various roles and countries. My last stint there was being the R&D director in London, running a small research team that I built up from 2013 to 2021, and my background is computational linguistics, English, computer science, and computer speech processing. And I'm teaching machine learning, the technical aspects of it, and I'm also teaching AI and ethics courses on a regular basis. So I try not, just to focus on the scientific/technical side of things, but to co-teach the responsibilities that come with that, knowing that technical side with it. And I've recently ran a course on bias, propaganda, media manipulation, fake news, including, automatic fake news detection methods. And that was a very popular course, and we actually studied reclassified papers that were presented to the US Senate about the US manipulation of the presidential elections in 2016, two very big volumes of data that you can find on the internet, very insightful. And just when the course finished, the few months later, the Ukraine was attacked, and that can of course be seen as a continuation of what began in 2015, 2016, this massively increased disinformation campaign that we have to cite. So in front of that, perhaps you could even argue that the media are a high risk area, because democracy depends on the fourth pillar of journalism and accurate reporting. But continuing with my interests, so in research, I focus on the nice triangle of natural language processing, information retrieval, and machine learning. So wherever the two of these three, or even all three of these show up, I'm really excited. In particular, I've been doing question answering research for 22 years. I've built summarizers. I've built topic models, alternatives to LDA, worked on automatic risk identification using NLP methods for the first time, and created terminology mining tools and entity resolvers, and worked, generally speaking, in various professional vertical areas on ad hoc retrieval systems using learning to rank and things like that, in the areas of law, news, media, journalism, pharmacology, and also risk compliance, counterterrorism, and finance, last but not least. And in terms of public policy, I've provided input to the UK's House of Lords AI Select Committee on AI regulation on behalf of Thomson Reuters when I lived in the UK. So I'm also interested in, what happens with the systems that we're building when they hit society. How can we kind of create appropriate rules that help us shape tomorrow's society, so that the outcome is to the benefit of the citizens and not just select, vendors or individuals that may benefit and leave the rest of us as a disadvantage. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges faced and what could be solutions? So before I talk about solutions and even challenges, I tend to think as a scientist very much in terms of what are the questions that we need to answer. And one important question that keeps me awake at night is, what makes good data really good data? What are actually the dimensions of quality that matter? And there are, errors in data. We all know that there are gaps in data. And some of these are quite harmless, but some of these can change lives. For example, if you have a spending gap, you may not have spent money for a year in a country, then you may not get a mobile phone contract because algorithms get confused. That actually happened to a relative of mine, because she was in Japan for a gap year, just to visit as a student. And she couldn't have a mobile phone. And that's ridiculous to somebody who is, a respected member of the medical profession, not to have a mobile phone contract, not by choice, but because, the credit scoring algorithm said not trustworthy person. So people don't know the why at the time, and nobody gives you explanations. And this has gradually been improved with GDPR and rules like that, but it's still considerable barriers to getting explanations about a lot of things. So the second point then is, what is standardization? I find it important to discuss what it can and cannot be expected to do. So standardization to me is the codification of existing best practices. And to me, that also means, and I may be controversial in this group, that I think we can only standardize solutions that have been found first and that have been accepted in a community of stakeholders as existing best practices. So that means we're currently not yet in a phase where we can standardize, but we can, of course, talk about standardization. It's like a phase of monitoring the activities of the people who come up with potential solutions, and then identifying, oh, there is one that seems to be, an emerging, best practice. Let's add it to the things we want to include in our future standards. But it is typically not something that works to try to standardize ahead of the curve when things are not really fleshed out yet. And what standardization cannot do also is it cannot help you against adversaries. So standardization is a process based on cooperation. I voluntarily comply with the standard. This means I impose restrictions on myself to do things in a certain way and not to do certain things at all. And because this is a voluntary process, it helps only with those people who are already quite unproblematic. So what we actually need most of all, most urgently, is a way to deal with adversaries who have no interest at all to comply with anything, who spend a lot of money on lobbying MEPs and others to make sure that any rule gets watered down and any compliance check can actually become a box ticking exercise where you do a few token things and then you can say, yeah, I tried my best to do A, B, and C, and I can prove it, so that they cannot not be fined. And in the worst case, they may actually just accept the fine and ignore all the rules altogether because they are so rich that the law, with even fines of 4% of annual revenue, if they are ever imposed, mean relatively little to them. It's kind of barely noticed. So that is quite an unusual setup, and it requires maybe unusual mechanisms to cope if we want to rescue democracy. And I speak here with some urgency because it's an important topic. So the third question is, what makes a data ecosystem, for example, the World Wide Web, or the ecosystem of commercial data, in which I've worked a lot in my career, what makes these data ecosystems work? What are actually the mechanisms that create success? Because you need to kind of connect with these success mechanisms, and one of them is incentives. Only then will you succeed, right? Because otherwise you're trying to work in a system that is sort of disconnected from what everybody else is trying to do. And speaking about incentives, on the present web, it's an attention community. So attention translates into dollars. If you can create attention, then you will be very rich. And that means that we get websites that when you scroll to the bottom, there is no bottom because people want you to keep scrolling, right? This is a technical effect that is purely a consequence of the web rewarding attention with financial outcomes. So in the past, before people, realized that on the web attention translates into money, websites had a bottom. It's as simple as that. You could scroll down, you could even see where you are on a page. There was a slide at the right that showed you had 50%. So scroll a little bit more and you're at the bottom, or even there was no scrolling at all. And these technical sort of behaviors that we face nowadays that seem to be quite arbitrary, they're not arbitrary at all. They're a direct consequence of the business model behind the internet. And the same with things like hate speech, whether it disappears or not. No, hate speech generates attention. It outrages people. They share it, they talk about it, or they get frightened by it. And therefore it translates into cash. And that means that ultimately these companies pretend to fix it, but they're not really doing the best they can. That's my impression. And if you fix the incentives, then this would be easier to fix than even with penalizing it, because a penalty, again, can be only within certain boundaries that are probably pocket money for most players that are relevant here. And then fourth, who should actually be the gatekeeper of truth? So for example, should a website censor hate speech? Because we don't want hate speech, but then we give them the power to decide who has the freedom of speech. And that's certainly more dangerous, perhaps, than even having hate speech, in my opinion. Certainly it should not be in the hand of a particular private commercial entity who is allowed to speak. And there was a lot of debate about that when, for example, Donald Trump got kicked out of Twitter because of the outrages and nasty things he said. And I agree with the assessment of nastiness, and I was likewise outraged about what he said. But I also question the decision to silence people by basically kicking them out of a platform, because it is a selective operation carried out by company policies that are neither transparent nor consistent, nor created by the community or the government. They are sort of company decisions. So they're commercial decisions ultimately. And that links us back to incentives and understanding the mechanics of the overall system. What are the players, what are the levers that we need to consider to find an actual solution that works? Yeah, so I guess there's still a bit that should have gone to the last slide, actually. I've been working on data science methodology can we just go back for a second to the previous slide? Maybe I wanted to make a point. Yeah, so I created a methodology. It's called data to value, and it's going to be published next week at NLDB after a few years work. I started around 2013 on it, and it's essentially an approach that takes ethical considerations into account, makes them an integral part of project work. And it also puts evaluation at the beginning rather than at the end of the process. So you have continuous quality monitoring rather than a final audit, one-time audit or something like that. Because I think the ethics of doing something should be checked at various well-defined points, notably when you put something in production, which is way after researchers hand something over. And it gets complicated further because people may just drop something that they researched on the internet, on GitHub, for example, and somebody may pick it up from there. So it's not even necessarily the same people that developed it that pick it up and use it for something in a very unintended way. And I say unintended because to those of you who followed yesterday's event, a lot of the legal definitions rely on the intended use. So suddenly, we have a scenario where the intended use is no longer considered because something is on GitHub, you download it, you find this seems to work for my application, and you just do it. And you're not even talking to the people. You don't even know the people who developed it. You may have an email address, but you tend to not get in touch with them because the code seems to do the job. So this disconnection between, the researchers that come up with something, with some model, with some data set, who may well know a lot more about the limitations and would not consider production use, are just not talking to the people who are downloading it and deploying it, and feel quite happy that they didn't have to write this from scratch, but they could just download a model and plug it in a bigger system. And here we come to another effect. If you take a system, you plug in a model somewhere, the system parts, of course, interact. You may have in any reasonable system multiple machine learning based models that were trained in isolation and were not trained to orchestrate well together. And that is something that hasn't even been discussed a lot in the literature. In practice, problems occur that cannot be really researched that well, because in research you tend to build small individual component models and not big systems that get used by real people. Next slide, please. Yeah, so now to this way forward and next steps. What can we actually do? What is going on? I find there's a recent trend in the sense that it was discovered about 2 weeks ago or so. I saw it for the first time, that large corporations are not just individually lobbying, which has been the case as long as companies and corporations have existed. They're even teaming up to pay for large-scale lobbying. So they're sharing this effort because they have a common interests. So they share the interests of the attention economy, and therefore it makes sense for them to bundle up their resources to get even more impact in preventing privacy protection laws in Europe and elsewhere. And this was maybe not surprising with the benefit of hindsight, but it still shocked me when I read about it, that it kept going on unrecognized for some time. And GDPR was a fantastic way forward, and Europe is still a leader in privacy protection. And this is good because as long as there's interaction between the various economies, the US economy, the Chinese economy, the European economy, then being compliant with GDPR will be impactful beyond just Europe, and to an extent, but also the implementation of GDPR is still spotty and lacks teeth. For example, there was a company called Buchbinder, a car rental company in Germany, that leaked all their customer data on the internet, and they were discovered by a computer magazine, CT, and this was exposed, and the Bavarian Data Protection Agency did not award a fine because it would have been harmful to that company, and the company was struggling. I'm sure if I did the same thing, not caring about this law or that law, I might get fined. So this is not just unjust. This is also very problematic, because we cannot have a selective implementation or enforcement of GDPR in Europe. We need to all be consistent and strongly protect the privacy rights, or people will just continue to be very sloppy with their IT systems, exposing millions of records on a regular basis and not worrying about the consequences. Finally, data quality or ethics audits seem to be a nice idea. I've been thinking about them. I even had a paper that proposed audits by internal ethics teams, but that seems to be problematic in the end, because experienced talent to conduct them is not available really. If it were available, it would be very expensive and time intensive. And I think the time intensiveness is probably even more of a problem than the cost. So some people yesterday said, big finance companies, they just, if it's necessary, they will just pay the cost. It will be marginal budget. But the time intensity, I mean, to even understand a large system that took maybe 2 years to build by a 10-people team, if that suddenly were to be audited, how long would that even take? How many people? And these companies would not want to have a delay being prevented from going to market by a year. That is seems like a century in IT. So the progress is very fast, and people don't want to give that up. They might say, yeah, a month is okay, but I don't think in a month you understand a system developed in 2 years by 10 people well enough to find these kind of issues of bias, unfairness, systems lacking human override possibilities in case of error. And there would have been like a very long checklist, and people would have to scrutinize the code, and the code may be lots of lines, not just written by the team, but also imported from the work of others, as we do these things now. So it could well be a 1 million line system, and you cannot audit that in a month or two, but you also can't really afford to wait for a year. So how much time would you actually allocate to that? And these practical questions I haven't actually heard discussed in the discussions where people talk about ethical audits or data quality audits and so on. So I think we need to address them. I think open source can help a lot. So as much as it has been mentioned by me now as source of potential problems also, but the opportunities it has actually vastly outnumber the problems, because open source is transparent by design, right? Not just the final code is transparent, the whole change history is public, and the conversations, the development process is public. That means while something is being developed, you can watch it, and everybody can be a sort of a micro auditor. And I think that is actually the safest mechanism that society currently has to make sure that nothing nasty is the outcome of it, that we have lots of eyes watching. And in the same sense that Wikipedia gets monitored by a volunteer crowd, we have the open source community, watching software for security bugs. They may also be educated to help with, unfairness questions. So if more software, especially government software, was going to be using open source, that would be a good thing in my opinion. But there is no known solution for the fact that all efforts are jurisdiction bound. So for example, if we say you can't do ABC in Europe because of unfairness and so on, then of course China may just shrug and decide to do things differently. Having said this, I am aware that China also has ethics related laws now, but I do not know how the enforcement works in China. I suppose it's probably very intricately linked with government interest.
Thank you so much, Johann, for the wealth and richness of information and perspectives, and all the factors that you have identified. Yeah, there's AI and plus media. I think that makes for a very intricate and complex landscape, trying to look at AI, but at the same time connecting to also all the different societal issues in this context and beyond, of course, because we're talking about big issues like democracy and freedom of speech, and also making sure that that society as a whole is helped and not deterred, and that things are kept for the good. There are so many questions. We have opened this can of worms, and we have a lot of questions on Slido as well. I will start by asking them to you, and so the first ones are for Simeon. Concerning benchmark data sets, what are the desirable properties of such data sets?
Yes, that's a very general and a good question. First of all, I think that beyond the desirable properties, there are also certain requirements that a dataset should fulfill to be used for benchmarking or to be publicly available. And those are that the dataset shouldn't expose any sensitive personal information, so that it is clear of privacy risks. And secondly, it shouldn't infringe on copyrights, especially if we are talking about media datasets. And these are two requirements that also, make the multimedia dataset creation and curation much more complex and expensive. In terms of desirable properties, I think the main desirable property that we should ensure is that the dataset should reflect well the real world task at hand. So if we are going to benchmark an AI model that classifies videos as deepfakes or not, then the dataset should have a representative set of cases from the real setting where this model will be deployed. We had actually there was a couple of years ago a very nice benchmarking activity organized by the Partnership on AI, where big companies and research institutions from the US primarily were involved, and they released a public data set for deepfake detection, the so-called deepfake detection challenge. And researchers and developers across the world had access to this dataset to develop their solution. And then the organizers had also a kind of hidden dataset where they benchmarked the submitted solutions, and then they presented the results. And there was a very striking difference between the methods, between the ranking of the methods and the scores, the accuracy scores of the methods in the public datasets that people had access to, and that they achieved in the hidden dataset. I think the error more than doubled, which means that the dataset that was public was not sufficiently representative of the cases that were in the hidden set. And yes.
So that means actually that we also need to gain perhaps a deeper understanding and to have a more clear definition of what actually a benchmarking data set is and what characteristics these data sets should have as well in the context that we work in now with so much data, because before maybe 100 examples or 1,000 examples or 500 instances that were annotated were enough, and now perhaps that's no longer that should
Yes.
no longer be the case. Or
Yes, I think it is now recognized that data sets below the many thousand examples threshold are considered quite small, and first of all, it's very hard to train deep learning models based on small data sets, even though there are efforts towards few shot learning. But indeed, yes, what actually can qualify as a benchmark data set is a good question. We actually see that research communities converge to specific data sets, sometimes out of necessity or convenience, because a data set, a public data set, is the only one available, but sometimes because a data set is actually a good proxy of the problem at hand and it's of good quality. And speaking of quality, I think, yes, the quality, especially in the labels, is a very important property of a good data set, and ensuring that the annotations, for instance, there is high agreement between different annotators in order to try to reduce the subjective labeling factor is important. And another very important is, the balance, or at least the good representation of different demographic groups, if we're talking about data sets involving human subjects. So in a nutshell, I think those are important properties of a good benchmark data set.
So I also would like to add a comment on that. So a couple of important points here. So first of all, deep learning was mentioned, yeah, because that's obviously where the action is in research. So everybody wants to use deep learning, and correctly said, deep learning requires many thousand data points, may require hundreds of thousands of data points depending on how big your model is, and you cannot train a model with billions and billions of parameters with 5 points of training data. Yeah, this means most parameters will not be changed, which means the model will not work. Now, the trouble is people are in research very keen. Most companies do not have the data sizes that are even in the many tens of thousands. They have small data sets, typically small, at best medium. And what I see now is this desire to throw deep learning algorithms at data sets that are inappropriate for deep learning. So all you can do is you can abandon deep learning and use more traditional machine learning methods like support vector machines, random forests, that are actually suitable for small to medium data sets. So if I were to design a checklist, I would say one point should be, is the machine learning model type suitable for the size or dimension of the size of the data set used for training? And in many cases, we might be shocked, what people are doing out there. Of course, we don't know. Most of it is not communicated, what's inside the box. But be aware that the Facebooks, the Googles, and the Microsofts, and the other FANG gang, as they're called, they have large data sets, and therefore they can achieve a lot of progress in deep learning. And for them, it's appropriate to use these methods and to push them. But for everybody else who may have small data sets, it may not be appropriate to aspire to use the same methods, because it is just inappropriate in terms of the insufficient training data being available, or this hunt for larger and larger models that is currently happening in the scientific sort of community is actually excluding the majority of practical use cases outside of these large consumer corporations. Because, for example, if you work in the space of professionals, so I worked a lot with clients that are lawyers, journalists, pharmacologists. These are small groups. So we're no longer talking about billions of users, because it's not Facebook where you and your grandmother can be on it. So everybody can. There are not that many lawyers, there are not that many pharmacologists. And that means that you need to have awareness that the same methods are not appropriate. That is hardly ever mentioned, though. And it should be taught, it should be communicated, but the scientific papers don't talk about it. They are in the deep learning area because that's where currently the hot research happens, driven by these consumer companies and their fantastic research teams. They're doing great works. I'm following them as well. But I just want to point out there are basically two camps now. Yeah, so the research world has basically split into the people who have the data and the people who haven't got the data. And the wannabe camp has a problem, and the camp of outside people adopting the output of these groups, they may download something from the Googles, the Facebooks of this world, and may not be aware that it's not the best pick for what they're trying to do because their own data set is too small.
Indeed, that is also a very important aspect to mention, that we're at the moment, I think there are these big models that are made available, that are trained using billions of text documents, and so you were mentioning the big companies, and it's great that we have these models also available to use them, but at the same time, indeed, it's important to remember always that they are not perhaps the best to use in all tasks, and that they might encode things that we don't understand, we have no idea about, that we cannot know, and they encode things that perhaps are not so desirable for our own application. So I think that's
give you another example. Let's take BERT, a fantastic model released by Google, used by almost everybody now in some variant. It uses only the first so and so many bytes or characters of input text. Let it be 512, but the number doesn't matter. So imagine what this means if I want to analyze a news story that has 600 characters. It means that the final summary of the story, where it kind of concludes and may link a previous incident with the current incident, gets cut off. And the people who use these models, they may not be told this, they may not be aware that not all of the text gets processed. And even people who use the model, they may be even ignorant and say, this is some cool Google model, it's available for download, I just use it for whatever.
I think that's where the danger lies, indeed, that people just they download the models and then they employ them for whatever.
Yeah, so this is essentially equivalent to you have a car and the brakes only work when you wear a green tie. So this is arbitrary to cut off a text after 512 characters. I understand the technical reason for it. It's fair enough, but to have that out there, and to have everybody sort of download it, there will be a subsegment of people who are kind of ignorant, or they knowingly or unknowingly don't address this issue and use that model in a system where leaving out the last sentence could actually cause enormous harm, at least in some constructed example situations. And this is, not perceived as a big error. This is perceived as, you can kind of work around it. You can, do various changes, but the problem of the original model remains. It's out there and it has this property that is annoying, undesirable, but once you use it in the wrong way, that little property can potentially cause a lot of harm. And I doubt that there's like even a checklist possible that could, you know, find out all these little things that could possibly be like that, because the list is maybe not even finite. Yeah, you need to know these models and you know the shortcomings, and then you would create maybe a per model specific checklist. Yeah, the expertise required is not generally had by everybody who is able to download these models, because everybody can download them. I don't need to be a researcher. I don't, like a school kid could download it and potentially plug it in somewhere. And you might say, yeah, that's okay to play around, and I agree. But then sometimes these things get out of hand and the system gets acquired by somebody. And yeah, so we need to be careful with the kind of machine learning, the kind of data, and the context of use and the limitations.
Indeed. So we have this the issue of quality and how what quality dimensions there should be mentioned together with the data, also with the models, and this off-the-shelf use, which is now becoming more problematic. We have a lot of questions still, so I will go very quickly through the so again, for Simeon, to what extent are AI professionals in media working with accessibility standards to mitigate bias?
Yes, to be honest, I was a bit puzzled with this question. Because I think accessibility standards refer to how you make certain media content accessible to people with disabilities or with limitations in senses. So of course there is important work done there. I'm not an accessibility expert, just to be clear. And I know that at least in Europe, the media organizations pay very much importance to accessibility standards and do effort in making content accessible. There is also the link to AI, because AI methods are used to automatically, or at least to speed up the process of making content accessible. But other than that, I'm not sure I can say something more useful as a response to this question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, indeed, it is an important part, and there's still a lot of work to be done there as well to say. I think there is a lot of work already done in accessibility and imposing that everything is accessible, and of course this influences how this pans out in the end. We can move on to the next question. I'm trying so they're all to Johann, but of course, Simeon, you are welcome to reply as well. Do you think that regulating AI intended use could avoid the disconnect between research and developers of AI and its deployers?
Regulating AI intended use.
Yes.
So I'm trying to understand what that might mean. I think regulation is a good thing. I think we cannot let stuff just, you know, be out there without any rules. There definitely needs to be more regulation. That's what I recommended in the past. And I think still this is the right thing to do. Question is what to regulate so that innovation is not slowed down on the one hand, and more importantly, that people are protected. So intended use. So I guess it means that you use one thing for a particular purpose where it's not suitable. Yeah, that you sort of, you regulate that relationship. You can use Lego, you can play with it, but you can't use Lego to do this. Yeah. So that's how I read the story. And I think this could be a solution. Yeah. I'm not sure whether a positive list could be made, because that would be too restrictive. And generally speaking, we have negative laws. So we want to live in a society where everything that is not forbidden is allowed automatically. That gives us freedom. And on the negative side, yeah, I guess we could create like negative lists that say, well, you're not allowed to use whatever BERT type model to analyze long letters if the second half of the letter could be important, yeah. Something like that, you know, to link back to the previous example, or similar things, yeah, to Simeon's examples of data bias. You are not allowed to use any method on a data set unless you have conducted a so-and-so check, you know, using some kind of standardized benchmark methodology that at some point we hope to have, yeah, when all this bias research is sort of reaches an agreeable state. Simon, what do you think to that?
Yes, I think I more or less agree. I think that already the AI Act is trying to regulate areas or applications that are not that are high risk, and so that's, I think, kind of regulating intended use, so that you are not allowed to use AI for specific, for instance, security applications, or involving very critical areas that affect human lives. But I agree that we should also not prevent innovation by over regulating and trying to control everything, essentially.
Yeah, and I would like to thank the person asking that question, because I now had an idea that I should say something that is sort of a converse statement. We should regulate perhaps the unintended use of things or counter-intentional use is a better word. So what we should regulate is if somebody should be penalized if they use something that was explicitly not just not intended, but not recommended for a particular use. I give you one example. Java, the programming language, you probably all know it, is not allowed to be used by the licensor, which used to be Sun Microsystems, now owned by Oracle though, for real-time control systems, because it uses a garbage collection mechanisms. That means that you cannot have hard guarantees on the response time of such a system. And therefore it would put people at risk. And unfortunately, this has actually been ignored. So I've seen several systems that are implemented in Java, and they claim sort of real-time, near real-time type behavior, and they get used in systems where I get dizzy when I see that. And another example is, for example, I've seen the use of Microsoft Windows outdated versions, so no longer recommended to be used anywhere, on trains, not in the passenger cabin, but in the sort of in the control space. And that also, you know, makes me worried. So I think we need to have regulations that enforce that negative recommendations. So if the developers say, do not use this for X, that this actually gets some teeth and it gets enforced, and people who violate these limitations get penalized for it because they do inappropriate things with a component that well-meaning developers have built, but warning, you can't do this with it, yeah, because it may explode. And if they do it anyway, then there should be some consequences. So thanks again to the person asking that. So that's not what the question was about, but that's the other side of it, you know, not regulating intended use, but regulating counter intentional use. So where people said, don't use it for X.
And that is a great idea, and of course there are numerous potentialities, especially because some things were developed, let's say in the beginning for some applications, and then potential other applications where people could think they could be used may change throughout the year, so we may not be able to foresee any
Yeah.
potential negative use. But I think it's a great way to, let's say, draw some attention and bring some. Yeah, I will just continue. Sorry, I have to continue with the questions.
Can I just make one sort of
Sure.
insert here? Sorry to interrupt, Alexandra. I want to give you one more example to show you the scale of this. This is really big. So imagine I say impactful code is written by a hobbyist. You might say, yeah, that can happen sometimes, but most likely not, right? It's more company code that matters, like machine learning models from Google or things like that, but not some single hobbyist. Well, there was a Finnish student called Linus Torvalds who for himself wrote some code, and that code now sits on all our mobile phones inside Android, and it's called Linux. So never assume that, some single person, doing stuff at home, unregulated and not, caring much about standards, at some point, just playing with a CPU, trying to squeeze out some power from his personal machine. But by sharing that data, sharing that code, it got really big, and then it may become something that may have to be checked in various ways, so that and the same could happen in the machine learning world. It hasn't happened at that scale, but it could, and that's why we need this kind of checks for counter intended use. Sorry, now back to you, Alexandra.
Yeah, well, indeed, I think we can also see a sort of counter movement, although it's more, it's less powerful and a bit more silent from the sort of open source community to try to create alternatives also to these big models that are freely made available by large companies, and trying to actually prove, to say, okay, we also don't need so much computing power, we can do it with less, trying to really make it possible to, let's say, make this a more inclusive process. So yeah. There is perhaps one more question. Oh, there are two questions, but I will perhaps leave the two more philosophical questions for the real end. We are actually at the end of the session, but I would perhaps just ask two more questions and then we can wrap up. For Simeon, since bias is difficult to pinpoint, do you see value in creating specialized data sets for assessing bias post-training? Is this already done?
Yes, there's definitely value in creating such data sets, and there are efforts, perhaps not specifically geared towards measuring bias, but efforts to make sure that data sets are bias aware, so that they contain a very good representation of different demographic groups or different classes of interest. And in that respect, there is also another relevant effort called data sheets for data sets, which is essentially an effort to try to document the characteristics of the data set, including the types of bias that the dataset may carry. And I think there's not probably such a thing as a bias-free dataset, because as I tried to say in the introduction, bias can be measured in many different ways, but at least it would be good to have a very good documentation of what are the known limitations and the known biases in the process of creating a data set.
Thank you very much. And I think it would be nice to finish with first sharing the mural. I noted down some things from the discussion, and I think, yeah, you can't really see everything, but I think we have a lot of elements from the brainstorming that we could, that I could take over to the mapping on standardization. We didn't prioritize, but I think for this we would need much more time. But I see there is a clear direction into the need for also defining the right metrology and terminology for the right terminology first for fairness, for bias. There were also discussions yesterday about defining AI in particular as well, saying exactly what is it in an AI system. So what is exactly the AI we are referring to? Then how do we measure quality in data? How do we measure the quality of benchmarking data sets? What are representative data sets? How do we have standards to assess compliance of models? Do we have access to, so how do we, can we standardize access to sufficiently representative data sets? How do we look at success mechanisms in data ecosystems? So different things. I hope I was able to capture everything. Yeah, if you have some other ideas, please let me know.
Can't actually quite read it. It's small.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. That's much better.
So just, I think we have captured a lot of the elements that we need in order to let's say suggest next steps and also pinpoint the pain points of these endeavors, both in data quality for AI as well as specifically for data quality for AI that is used in the media. There are probably many more elements that need to be that could be mentioned here, but I think the discussions around off-the-shelf data, off-the-shelf models, the requirement for taxonomies and vocabularies that actually describe the characteristics, then the testing, what does it mean to be suitable in the context of shifting domains, for example. And then, of course, there's the entire discussion on the business models and what regulatory needs there are and what assessments can be done so that that business models are not let's say linked to creating content which is not suitable just because it generates high revenue. So yeah, I think we have run very much over time. So I would just end with a philosophical question, which is asked on Slido to Johann, which is it all possible to define one version of truth across contexts, cultures, and regions?
If you're talking about logical truth, then I would say yes, not in the sense of poetical truth, or maybe there are different flavors beyond that. But truth is dependent on context. Yeah. So even whether I know something, whether I can claim I know something, that can mean different things, and it can be more or less true in the sense of I can have a deeper knowledge, or I may have just heard of something. So context is the key element, that and cultural context is part of that context. So I liked yesterday's statement that we cannot leave the context out. And I can't remember who said it, but I would very much agree with it, that what we can probably not do is be successful by just looking at one thing, for example, data quality, or one dimension of data quality, like, let's say, bias or fairness, or things like gender, and ignore everything else. It's very much a holistic play, which makes it so difficult, because you need lots of expertise in different fields, and you need to have lots of awareness of different things, how things get used, how things work in industry, how things work in academia, what people will and will not likely do, whatever you would like to have, right? So certain people are not going to change the way they work just because we would like it. So we need to consider what happens, what are things that we cannot change, or not easily change, and what are the things that we can easily change, or where people would immediately say, yeah, if you give me that, I would apply it. That would be not much work. So if that helps, if that solves it, so we need to find a viable way. And then, but the question of what is true is very hard to decide when you're not on the ground. Yeah, to give you an example of a sort of fake news detection, is this fact verification question. You read some story, let's say about Ukraine today, what happens in Ukraine today. How will you verify that if you are not there? Yeah, and then if people say, well, we have this journalist there, you would have to verify that even that's true, that you can trust them, because it could be fabricated. And then you would have to verify that that person is reporting in a trustworthy way. So there are many things that sort of in the past were sort of automatic. People had professional attitudes and ethics and morals, and a lot more is now to be questioned, just because things that used to be a given are questionable. And I don't think that part is a cultural thing. I think this is the same still everywhere. And it has to do, with money and greed, that essentially people are trying to buy this propaganda, and buy people to conduct propaganda. And if the money is right, then you can always find somebody who is willing to throw out their morals for it. So we need to create a system that is robust enough to do that, so that we can find out what that one truth is. And I do think that one truth exists. For example, if the president of Ukraine was shot dead today, there is only one true answer. Either that happened today, or it has not happened today. And I made this up. It's entirely fictional, in case you get scared. So I don't think there is some discussion about the truth value of propositions. But of course, your question is probably motivated by the point that cultures have different ways of arriving at a sort of societal truths and values, and that the fact that not all societies are the same suggests that you can do things differently, right? And that is, for me, part of cultural context, not part of the truth itself, but other people may see that differently. That's my short answer, and it's not very short.
Thank you so much. Indeed, that ties very much, there's this distinction between the logical truth and the observable truth, and then also the perspective of things. And I think that's where also human bias comes in. And that's something that we also have to pay attention to. So what are we as humans biased towards, and how can we become more aware of our own bias so that we are clearer on the truth. Thank you so much to everyone for your participation. Thank you so much to Simeon and Johann for all the richness of information and knowledge and insights that you have shared, and all your views on the needs and further steps. Thank you everyone for participating. Thank you so much to Livia for all her support in conducting the session in the background, albeit in the background, but really important, and thanks for everything. And now we are going to have a break for lunch, but we're coming back afterwards with a flash summaries session from all the panels, and then a final panel for discussion on ways forward, and the closing session. So we are looking forward to the next sessions. Thank you again, and see you later. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.